What would you do if you heard your own voice calling from the darkness? I didn't think anything could scare me after all I've been through. But this RV trip to Big Bend National Park proved me wrong. Whispering shadows, claw marks on my RV, and a figure that mimicked my voice. This wasn't a nightmare. It was real. And I barely made it out alive. If you're brave enough to hear the full story, stick around, and don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Let me know in the comments, what would you do in my shoes? Let's dive in. After months of battling sleepless nights and the lingering grief of losing my brother, I thought escaping to the vast emptiness of Big Bend National Park in Texas would clear my mind. I packed my RV with everything I needed, my camera gear, enough supplies to last a week, and a resolve to find solace in isolation. Big Bend was a photographer's dream. Rugged cliffs, sweeping desert landscapes, and the kind of sunsets that seemed to bleed into the horizon. I'd read about its quiet beauty in travel blogs, and the idea of spending a few days alone in its stillness felt like the perfect reset. What I didn't realize was how quickly silence can turn on you. I arrived mid-afternoon, the Texas sun blazing as I parked my RV at the edge of a remote campsite. Dust swirled in the warm breeze as I stepped out, the weight of the heat pressing against my skin. The only sounds were the faint rustle of wind against the scrub and the distant call of a hawk. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. I spent the first few hours setting up. The campsite was as basic as they came. No electricity, no cell service, and a fire pit that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. As I unfolded my camping chair, I couldn't help but marvel at the raw, untamed beauty around me. The jagged cliffs loomed in the distance, and the sparse vegetation stretched endlessly. This wasn't just isolation, it was complete detachment from the world. Exactly what I needed. After unloading my camera gear, I wandered around to scout potential shots. The afternoon light painted the desert in golden hues, and I snapped photo after photo, losing track of time. The shadows stretched longer as the sun dipped lower, and I decided to call it a day. I'd come back out at dawn when the lighting was softer. Back at the RV, I pulled out a folding chair and cracked open a soda, letting the stillness settle over me. The sun began to sink, staining the sky in fiery reds and oranges. It was beautiful and eerily quiet. Too quiet. I told myself it was nerves. This was my first solo camping trip, and I wasn't used to being completely alone. But even as I brushed off the unease, a faint sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I glanced around. Nothing but empty desert. Still, the feeling lingered. By the time night fell, I was ready to crawl into the RV and lock the door. Before heading inside, I noticed something odd near the edge of the campsite. A set of footprints in the dust. They were faint but visible, leading away from my RV and disappearing into the desert. Strange. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I tried not to let the footprints bother me as I stepped into the RV and locked the door behind me. Maybe they were old, left by a hiker or camper who'd been here before me. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something about them didn't sit right. They weren't boot prints like you'd expect from someone trekking through the desert. They were barefoot and small, almost like a child's. Shaking off the unease, I busied myself with preparing a quick dinner. The RV was cozy, lit by a single warm light above the kitchenette. Outside, the desert night had settled in, wrapping the world in an almost suffocating darkness. I could hear the occasional sound of the wind brushing against the RV, and the faint creak of the vehicle settling on its tires. I told myself I was imagining things. After eating, I decided to review the photos I'd taken that afternoon. As I flipped through them on my camera's small screen, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. The shots were technically fine, perfectly framed and exposed, but something about them felt off. They lacked life. As if the desert itself had refused to reveal its soul to me. I chalked it up to fatigue and resolved to try again in the morning. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights and lay down in the small bed at the back of the RV, pulling a thin blanket over me. The darkness inside was comforting at first, a barrier between me and the vast unknown outside. But then came the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft shuffling noise, like feet dragging against gravel. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear through the silence. There it was again. This time louder, closer. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? A coyote, maybe? But the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too deliberate, too human. I sat up slowly. My flashlight was on the counter a few feet away, but I didn't dare move. The sound circled the RV, stopping occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was outside was listening. My breath hitched when I heard a faint knock against the side of the RV. It wasn't aggressive, just a soft tap, almost polite. But it sent a jolt of fear straight through me. I mustered the courage to slide off the bed and grab the flashlight. Keeping the beam low, I crept to the window near the door and peeked through the blinds. The pale moonlight illuminated the campsite, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I scanned the area, my hands trembling. Nothing, just emptiness. And then I saw them, the same footprints from earlier, but now there were more. They circled the RV, fresh in the dust, leading off into the darkness. My stomach churned as a cold realization settled over me. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound outside the RV felt amplified. The creak of the wind against the door, the faint rustling of dry leaves, and most hauntingly, the occasional shuffle of footsteps. I sat in the small kitchenette, flashlight clutched in my hand, my ears straining for anything out of the ordinary. The silence between each sound was worse than the noise itself. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, I was exhausted, but relieved. The golden hues of the rising sun brought a fragile sense of safety, though it didn't erase what had happened during the night. I forced myself to step outside, cautiously scanning the area. The footprints were still there, but they were different now, more erratic, as if whoever had made them had been pacing around the RV. They ended abruptly at the edge of the campsite, where the scrubland stretched out into endless desert. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it had to be a prank. Maybe a local kid or some other camper had wandered too close, trying to spook me. I wasn't about to let a few footprints ruin my trip, or my project. Grabbing my camera, I set off to explore a nearby trail I'd spotted the day before. If I could lose myself in the landscape, maybe I could forget about last night. The trail wound through jagged rock formations, with steep inclines that gave way to breathtaking views of the valley below. The air was crisp, the kind that feels heavy with silence. As I walked, I snapped photo after photo, trying to capture the essence of the barren beauty around me. For a moment, I felt like myself again, focused on the art, letting the fear melt away. But then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I stopped, holding my breath. The whisper came again, carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the desert acoustics. But the sound grew clearer, more deliberate. My name. Amy. I whipped around, my camera swinging against my chest. The trail behind me was empty, the valley below bathed in morning light. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. Just endless rock and sky. Still, the voice had been unmistakable, soft, low, and far too familiar. It sounded like my brother. I stood frozen, the camera in my hand suddenly feeling heavy. He was gone. He'd been gone for nearly 2 years. There was no way I could have heard him. But the whisper hadn't been my imagination. I was sure of it. I backed away from the trail. The camera hung limply at my side as I turned and made my way back to the RV. Something wasn't right here, and I was starting to wonder if coming to Big Bend alone had been a terrible mistake. I spent the rest of the morning locked inside the RV, trying to convince myself that I'd misheard the whisper. Maybe it was the wind echoing off the cliffs, or maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. After all, this was my first trip completely alone. I'd wanted solitude, and now I had it, too much of it. But as I stared out the small RV window, my rationalization started to crumble. The footprints were still there, faint but undeniable, circling the vehicle like a predator stalking prey. They hadn't faded overnight, and the sight of them sent a chill through me. It wasn't just that they were there. It was the fact that they seemed purposeful, deliberate. I decided I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I wasn't going to pack up and run over something that could be easily explained. So I did what I always do when I feel out of control. I picked up my camera and started shooting. The dusty campsite, the jagged rocks in the distance, even the footprints. I needed to focus on something, anything, to take my mind off the growing unease. Around midday, I decided to hike a short trail that led to a small overlook about a mile away from the campsite. It was a relatively easy trek, and the view promised a sweeping panorama of the desert. Armed with my camera, a water bottle, and a growing determination to push through the anxiety, I set out. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, the towering rock walls blocking most of the midday sun. The air felt cooler here, and the sound of my footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space. I focused on the crunch of gravel underfoot, trying to keep my mind from wandering to darker thoughts. The light was perfect, and I paused several times to capture the play of shadows on the canyon walls. As I rounded a bend, something on the ground caught my eye. I stopped, crouching down to inspect it. A small pile of stones, carefully stacked into a crude tower. It looked like one of those cairns hikers sometimes leave to mark trails, but this one felt out of place. It wasn't near the trailhead, and there was no reason for anyone to leave one here. A rustling sound behind me made me stand up abruptly, my heart pounding. I spun around, my camera swinging at my side, but the canyon was empty. I scanned the area, expecting to see an animal darting between the rocks, but there was nothing. The silence pressed in around me, thick and stifling. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a lizard had scurried through the brush. But as I turned to continue down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The weight of unseen eyes seemed to follow me with every step, and the whisper of my name echoed faintly in the back of my mind. I picked up my pace. By the time I reached the overlook, my nerves were frayed. The view was everything I had hoped for: endless stretches of desert, the jagged mountains in the distance, and the kind of solitude that should have been awe-inspiring. But instead of feeling exhilarated, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I set up my camera and started framing shots, trying to focus on the task at hand. The wind whipped through the canyon, carrying with it faint whispers that I told myself were nothing more than the breeze. But no matter how much I tried to immerse myself in the beauty of the landscape, I couldn't shake the unease. My eyes kept darting to the edges of my vision, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. As I adjusted the camera's focus, I caught a glimpse of movement in the viewfinder. My breath hitched, and I froze. At the far edge of the frame, near a cluster of rocks, a figure stood motionless. I lifted my head to look directly, but the space was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the spot, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow cast by the uneven terrain? Shaking off the fear, I glanced back through the viewfinder. The figure was gone. I lowered the camera and let out a shaky laugh. Get it together, Amy. It was probably nothing, a mirage maybe, or my imagination running wild after a sleepless night. But as much as I tried to dismiss it, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The hike back to the campsite was uneventful, but the oppressive silence weighed heavily on me. Even the usual desert sounds, the chirp of insects, the rustle of small animals in the brush, seemed absent. It was as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. When I finally reached the RV, I noticed something new. At first I thought it was dirt or mud smeared on the side of the vehicle, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't that simple. For long, parallel marks ran down the side of the RV, starting high near the window and trailing downward toward the ground. They were deep, gouging into the paint and exposing the metal beneath. Claw marks. My stomach twisted as I ran my fingers over them. They were rough and jagged, as if something or someone had raked sharp nails down the surface. I looked around, my eyes darting to the surrounding desert, but there was no one in sight. I hurried inside and locked the door behind me, my pulse racing. Sitting at the small table, I tried to calm myself, but my mind kept replaying the events of the day. The footprints, the whispers, the figure in the viewfinder, and now this. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. And the worst part? The sun was already dipping below the horizon. Night was coming. And I wasn't sure I was ready for it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert transformed into an entirely different beast. The warm golden glow was replaced by an oppressive darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow the landscape whole. But even the light didn't feel safe. Shadows clung to the edges, shifting and twisting as if alive. I sat at the small dining table with my camera, flipping through the photos I had taken that day. I hoped that focusing on something familiar would calm my nerves. The shots of the overlook were stunning, but my attention kept returning to one image, the one where I thought I'd seen a figure. My thumb hovered over the zoom button for a moment before I finally gave in. Enlarging the image, I felt a chill run down my spine. There it was. A shape faint but undeniable, standing near the rocks. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions slightly off. The head was too large, the limbs too thin, and its stance felt unnatural. My hands trembled as I stared at the figure, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or an odd shadow. But the longer I looked, the less certain I became. A loud bang against the RV made me jump, the camera slipping from my hands and clattering onto the table. My heart pounded as I froze, listening. Another bang followed, this one heavier, like something was pressing against the side of the vehicle. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, careful to stay out of sight. Slowly I lifted the corner of the curtain and peeked outside. The beam from the exterior lights illuminated the desert floor, casting long shadows across the dust and scrub. At first I didn't see anything, but then my eyes caught movement near the edge of the light. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the glow, partially obscured by the darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. I couldn't make out any details, but the way it moved, slow, deliberate, sent a jolt of fear through me. Then, it stepped closer. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, my breathing ragged. The sound of my own voice broke the silence, low and deliberate, coming from just outside the RV. "Amy, come outside!" It wasn't possible. The voice was mine, but distorted, stretched like a recording slowed down to a crawl. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help. But there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. The knocking started again, this time at the door. Slow, rhythmic, each knock reverberating through the small space. My body felt frozen, trapped between terror and disbelief. The voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. Amy, it's okay. Come outside. I sat down hard on the floor, pressing my hands over my ears. Whatever was out there knew my name, and it wasn't going to leave. The knocking didn't stop. It was patient, unrelenting, like it knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Each soft thud made my skin crawl. My breathing was shallow, my hands trembling as I gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. I whispered to myself, a desperate mantra. It's not real! It's not real! It's not real! But it was real, and it was right outside my door. The RV felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in on me as the knocks grew louder. I scrambled to the window again, unable to resist the urge to check. This time, I didn't lift the curtain, just the smallest crack, enough to see outside without being seen. My heart stopped. The figure was closer now, standing directly in front of the door. The harsh beam of the RV's exterior light barely touched it, but I could make out more details. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadows clung to it, obscuring its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and intrusive, as if it could see straight through the walls. Then it moved its head. Snapped upright, and for the first time, I saw its eyes. Deep, hollow voids that seemed to pull the light into them. It stepped closer, into the full glow of the exterior lights. My stomach turned. Its body was wrong, stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic. It wasn't human, but it was trying to be. The way it stood, the way it tilted its head, even the faint outline of a mouth. It was mimicking humanity, but it couldn't quite get it right. It knocked again, this time harder, more urgent. My voice followed, eerily calm and coaxing. Amy, open the door. It's safe. I promise. Tears blurred my vision as I backed away from the window. My flashlight clattered to the floor, but I didn't pick it up. I couldn't stop shaking. My mind raced with fragmented thoughts. This can't be happening. It's not possible. What does it want? But one thing was clear. I couldn't let it in. I grabbed my keys from the counter, my fingers fumbling as I stuffed them into my pocket. I needed to get out of here, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, to not draw attention. To myself, the RV suddenly felt like a flimsy cage, offering no real protection. I forced myself to move, crawling toward the driver's seat as quietly as possible. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the thing outside began to speak again. Amy, it said, stretching my name into a sinister melody. Don't make me wait. The voice was louder now, deeper, echoing unnaturally, as if there were two voices speaking at once, one mine and one something else. I pressed my back against the cabinet, clutching my keys, and waited. The footsteps paused near the driver's side window, and then it whispered, I know you're in there. I don't know how long I sat there, pressed against the cabinet, too scared to breathe. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. My mind raced, searching for a plan, any plan, but every option felt like a dead end. Running wasn't an option. Whatever that thing was, it had been faster and more deliberate than anything I'd ever seen. Staying inside the RV felt like a trap, but at least there were walls between me and it. Then came the scraping. It started low, almost gentle, like fingernails dragging across the side of the RV. The sound slithered through the silence, raising goosebumps on my arms. The scrape moved from the driver's side window to the front door, slow and deliberate, like it was tracing the outline of the vehicle. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to scream, as the noise grew louder, sharper, until it stopped abruptly. Then, in the eerie stillness, I heard my name again. Amy! This time the voice wasn't outside. It was inside. I whipped my head toward the back of the RV, where the small bedroom area was cloaked in shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness, my heart thundering in my chest. The flashlight was still lying on the floor where I dropped it earlier. I scrambled to grab it, my shaking hands fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the empty bed and the tiny storage compartments above it. There was nothing there. But I could feel it. Something was watching me. The air inside the RV felt heavy, suffocating. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, boring into my skin. The urge to run was overwhelming, but where would I go? The desert outside offered no shelter, no safety. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, I heard it again. Amy. The voice was clearer now, coming from the back of the RV. It was mine, but twisted, layered with something darker. My stomach churned as I backed toward the front, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The beam trembled in my hands, casting jittery shadows across the cramped space. Then I saw it. At first it was just a flicker, movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned the flashlight toward the back, I froze. A shadow, darker than the surrounding dimness, shifted near the bed. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form bending and twisting to fit the confines of the RV. It didn't have a face, just an outline of a humanoid shape that seemed to pulse and shift as if made of smoke. The shadow leaned forward, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a smile, a grotesque, unnatural curve where a mouth should be. The flashlight flickered, and I stumbled backward, panic surging through me. That's when it whispered again, almost teasingly, "Let me in." The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. Its beam rolled lazily across the RV, casting shifting shadows that made the space feel even smaller. My back hit the kitchenette counter, and I froze, every nerve in my body screaming to run, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. The shadow in the back of the RV didn't lunge, didn't rush at me. Instead, it loomed, its presence filling the air like a weight pressing against my chest. The smile lingered, or what I thought was a smile. It wasn't a mouth in the traditional sense, just a curved distortion where its face should have been. The shadow tilted its head, slow and deliberate, almost as if it were studying me. Then it spoke again, my voice layered with something guttural and wrong. "Amy, you can't hide. I see you." I bit my lip to stifle a whimper, my eyes darting toward the door. My keys were still in my pocket. I just needed to make it there, unlock the door, and run. But where? Into the pitch-black desert where this thing could follow me. My fingers curled into fists as I fought to think. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. The shadow began to move, gliding forward without taking steps. Its form pulsed unnaturally, stretching and shrinking as it approached. I grabbed the nearest thing, a kitchen knife sitting in the drying rack, and held it out in front of me, my hands trembling. My voice came out in a shaky whisper. "Stay away." The shadow stopped. For a moment the RV was eerily silent, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then it began to laugh, a low, distorted sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't loud, but it carried an eerie weight, like it knew something I didn't. The flashlight on the floor flickered again, its beam sputtering as if the light itself was being drained. I wanted to scream, to run, but the shadow's laugh grew louder, echoing in the confined space of the RV. "You think you can stop me?" it said, its voice now deeper, more malevolent. "You can't fight what you invited." Invited? The word hit me like a slap. I hadn't invited anything. I'd come here alone, intentionally isolating myself, but my thoughts flashed back to the trail, to the pile of stones I'd seen stacked like an altar. Had I disturbed something by being there? Had I crossed some line without knowing it? My breath came in short gasps as panic clawed at my chest. The shadow surged forward, its form stretching until it seemed to fill the entire space. Instinct took over. I kicked the flashlight toward it, grabbed the knife with both hands, and swung wildly. The blade passed through the shadow as if it were smoke, and the laughter erupted again, this time louder, deafening. The RV began to shake violently, as if caught in an earthquake. Cabinets banged open, dishes clattered to the floor, and I lost my balance, falling hard onto my side. Above the chaos, the voice spoke one last time, a mocking whisper that sent terror straight through me. "Run, Amy, run!" Then everything went silent. The silence that followed was almost worse than the chaos. The RV had gone deathly still, and even the wind outside seemed to have disappeared. I lay on the floor, clutching the knife like a lifeline, my chest. For a moment, I thought it might be gone, that maybe the nightmare had ended. Then I saw the door handle twitch. A slow, deliberate turn, like someone testing it from the outside. My stomach twisted into a knot, and I scrambled backward on the floor until my back hit the base of the kitchenette cabinets. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen, trapped between terror and disbelief. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, rattling in its socket. Whatever was out there wanted in. I fumbled for the flashlight, still lying a few feet away, its beam weak and flickering. Grabbing it with trembling hands, I aimed it at the door. The handle stopped moving. My breath caught as I stared, waiting, expecting it to burst open at any second. But instead, a low scratching sound began to creep through the thin metal of the door. It was faint at first, like nails dragging across the surface, but it grew louder, more insistent. Then came the voice again. My voice. "Amy, please let me in. It's cold out here." The tone was soft, almost pleading, but the distorted echo beneath it gave away its true nature. It wasn't anything human. I shook my head, gripping the knife tighter, my knuckles white. "No," I whispered under my breath, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. "You're not real." The scratching stopped. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe it had given up. But then the window beside the door darkened. A shadow blocked the faint moonlight streaming in, and I realized with a sickening dread that it was standing right there, just on the other side of the glass. My hand instinctively moved to cover my mouth, stifling a scream, as the shape leaned closer, pressing against the window. It didn't have a face, but it was trying. The outline of a nose, hollow indentations where eyes should have. That grotesque curve of a mouth. Too wide, too unnatural. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to shift, mimicking the contours of a human face, but never quite getting it right. The shadow tapped the glass with a single elongated finger, the sound sharp and deliberate. Then it whispered, "You can't stay in there forever." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I crawled to the driver's seat, shoved the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine sputtered to life, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope. I didn't look at the window as I slammed the RV into gear. I didn't want to see if it was still there. I just pressed the gas and drove into the darkness, leaving the campsite and the shadow behind. Or so I thought. The RV roared to life, its headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness as I sped away from the campsite. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, my foot pressing the gas pedal almost to the floor. The desert landscape rushed by in ghostly hues of black and gray, but I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The tension in my chest didn't ease as I drove. If anything, it grew worse. My mind raced, replaying the events of the past few hours in a chaotic loop. The shadow, the laughter, the way it whispered my name in my voice. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing on the road behind me, but the view was empty, just a desolate expanse of desert stretching into the night. That was when the headlights flickered. At first, it was just a quick blink, so fast I almost thought I'd imagined it. But a few seconds later, it happened again, this time longer. The engine stuttered, and the RV shuddered as if something had gripped its frame. My heart raced, and I muttered a frantic plea under my breath, pressing the gas harder. The engine roared back to life, the headlights steady again. But the reprieve didn't last. The lights flickered once more, and this time they went out completely, plunging the RV into darkness. The engine sputtered and died, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the soft creak of the vehicle settling into stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for the flashlight, flipping it on and sweeping the beam across the dashboard. The RV was silent. Too silent. Even the wind outside had stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness that felt unnatural. I tried the ignition again, twisting the key with shaking hands, but the engine refused to turn over. "Come on," I whispered desperately, as if pleading with the machine would make it work. And then I heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap against the back of the RV. My breath hitched and I froze, the flashlight beam shaking as I turned toward the sound. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving toward the side of the vehicle. It wasn't random, it was purposeful, like someone running their fingers along the metal shell. "Amy!" The voice was back, but this time it didn't just come from one direction. It surrounded me, filling the RV like a cold wind, echoing in layers that made my skin crawl. I swung the flashlight toward the window, and my stomach dropped. The shadow was there, pressed against the glass, its form darker and more defined than before. Its face was clearer now, almost human but distorted in ways that made my eyes water. It leaned closer, and for the first time, its smile moved. "Let's go for a ride," it said, its voice dripping with malice. I screamed, grabbing the knife again as the shadow's fingers slid across the window, leaving streaks of darkness that seemed to eat the light from my flashlight. I had to get out of here, but there was nowhere to go. For the first time I realized the truth. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The shadow was inside the RV. My flashlight's beam trembled as I swung it wildly around the cramped space, but the light only seemed to make the shadows grow deeper, darker. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the RV itself had turned against me. I clutched the knife, my hands trembling so hard it was difficult to keep my grip. "Stay away!" I shouted, though my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. I expected the shadow to attack, to lunge at me, but instead it lingered, its dark form coalescing in the corner near the kitchenette. It was almost worse that it didn't move, like it was waiting for something. The RV began to shake again, a low vibration that rattled the cabinets and sent dishes clattering to the floor. The shadow stretched, its form pulling upward until it nearly touched the ceiling. I could feel it staring at me, even without eyes, its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. "You invited me, Amy," it whispered, its voice low and mocking. "Didn't you want company?" I shook my head violently, backing away toward the driver's seat. "I didn't invite anything. I don't even know what you are." My voice cracked as I tried to sound defiant, but the fear in my tone betrayed me. The shadow laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh, but you did," it said. "You came here alone, searching for something. You brought your grief, your guilt, and you called out." "And I answered. Tears blurred my vision as the shadow began to move toward me, its form pulsing and shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. My back hit the door, and I fumbled for the handle, twisting it desperately. Locked. My own safety measures had become my prison. The shadow was inches away now, its towering form bending down toward me. The vague outline of a face appeared, twisting grotesquely as it spoke. "You've carried him with you for so long," it said, its voice now soft, almost soothing. "I can take the pain away. I can give him back to you." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow's words sank in. It couldn't mean my brother. It wasn't possible. My brother was gone. And yet, the thought of seeing him again, of hearing his voice one more time, cut through the fear like a knife. My grip on the blade in my hand faltered. The shadow seemed to sense my hesitation. Its form shifted again, and for a split second, I saw him. My brother. His face, his smile, so real it made my chest ache. "Amy," he said, his voice soft and familiar. "Come with me." I almost dropped the knife, my body leaning forward instinctively. But then I saw it, the flicker. For just a moment, his face wavered, distorted, and I realized the truth. It wasn't him. It was never him. "No!" I screamed, raising the knife and slashing wildly at the air. The shadow recoiled, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The RV shuddered violently, and then everything went still. The shadow was gone. For now. The stillness after the shadow's retreat was suffocating. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the knife slipping from my trembling hands and clattering onto the floor. The RV was eerily silent, the oppressive weight of its presence temporarily lifted, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. I stumbled to the driver's seat, my fingers fumbling to start the engine again. The key turned, and for one brief, blessed moment, the RV sputtered to life. Relief flooded through me, until the lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness once more. I hit the steering wheel in frustration, cursing under my breath. The flashlight sat on the floor, its beam now faint and flickering. I snatched it up, scanning the interior of the RV. Nothing. The space looked exactly as it had before the nightmare began, small, cramped, and utterly ordinary. But I could feel it, lingering just out of sight. My pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't stay here. I needed to get out. Now. The door was still locked, the handle cool and smooth under my shaking hand. My mind screamed at me to leave, but stepping outside felt like walking into an open trap. I hesitated, glancing at the window. The desert outside was pitch black, the faint outlines of distant rocks barely visible under the thin sliver of moonlight. But it was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling of animals, just an oppressive void of sound. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The metal creaked loudly in the stillness, sending a jolt of panic through me. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped outside, the air cool against my sweat-soaked skin. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and empty, but the feeling of being watched was inescapable. My boots crunched against the dirt as I circled the RV, the flashlight illuminating claw marks that raked down its sides, deeper and more jagged than before. My stomach churned at the sight, and I fought the urge to turn back. I needed to keep moving. Staying in one place felt like a death sentence. I headed toward the trailhead, my camera bag bouncing against my side. The rational part of me screamed that this was a terrible idea, that I should have stayed inside and waited for daylight. But the other part, the part ruled by raw animal instinct, knew the RV wasn't safe. The shadow could get inside. It already had. Out here at least, I had a chance to run. As I reached the edge of the trail, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like wind brushing against my ears. My name, over and over, spoken in tones both familiar and alien. I froze, the flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the path ahead. The trail was empty, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, from somewhere deeper in the darkness, a voice called out. "Amy! Don't you want to see him again?" I froze at the sound of the voice, my stomach twisting into knots. It was his voice, my brother's. Soft, gentle, exactly how I remembered it. But the way it carried through the air, low and distorted, sent a chill racing up my spine. It wasn't him. It couldn't be him. He was gone. "Amy!" the voice called again, softer this time, as if coaxing me forward. "Come closer. I need to see you." My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the trail ahead. The beam caught on twisted branches and jagged rocks, but nothing moved. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the air thick and heavy. My rational mind screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the RV and lock the door. But something deeper, something primal, pulled me forward. The sound of his voice stirred a longing I hadn't felt in years, a desperate, aching hope to see him again. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. "You're not him?" I whispered, as much to myself as to the shadow lurking in the dark. My legs felt like lead as I took a cautious step forward. "You're not real!" The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, like a chorus of voices all speaking my name. They surrounded me, coming from every direction, and no matter where I pointed the flashlight, there was nothing there. The trail ahead seemed endless, stretching into a void of blackness that swallowed the light. Then I saw it. Just ahead, at the edge of the flashlight's reach, was a figure. It stood motionless, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moonlight. My breath hitched, and my chest tightened as I recognized the shape of the shoulders, the way it held its head. It was him, my brother. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the whispers continued to swirl around me. "It's not you," I said louder, trying to steady my shaking hands. "You're not real." But then the figure took a step forward, and I swore my heart stopped. The flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to stay steady, and for a moment, his face came into focus. It was Danny, exactly as I remembered him. Messy hair, the same warm, crooked smile. Tears welled in my eyes as a wave of emotions crashed over me. Grief, guilt, and something dangerously close to relief. "Amy," he said again, his voice steady and kind. "It's okay, I'm here. You don't have to be alone anymore." My throat tightened as I fought the urge to run to him. "You're not real," I choked out. But my feet didn't move. My heart ached to believe it was true, to close the gap between us and feel his embrace again. The figure tilted its head, the smile on its face widening just a little too far. "I've missed you," it said, its voice shifting slightly, deeper now, layered with something sinister. "Come with me. Let me take the pain away." And that's when I realized, whatever this thing was, it had been waiting for this moment. It wanted me to follow, to surrender, to let it win. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure ahead. The longer I looked, the less real it seemed, like a memory unraveling before my eyes. The crooked smile I knew so well began to stretch unnaturally, the corners of its mouth pulling too far back, revealing something sharp and jagged beneath. This wasn't Danny. It was never Danny. The whispers around me grew louder, more insistent, as if they could sense my hesitation. "Amy," the figure said again, its voice a sick blend of familiarity and menace. "Don't you want to see him? Don't you want to make this right? tears blurred my vision as guilt and grief clawed at my chest. I'd carried the weight of Danny's death for so long. The accident had been out of my control, but it didn't matter. The guilt stayed, and this thing knew it. It was feeding on it, twisting the knife in the wound I'd tried so hard to heal. I took a shaky step backward, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "You're not him," I said, my voice trembling. "You're not real." The figure cocked its head, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if trying to mimic human gestures but failing. "I can be," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "All you have to do is come with me. Let me take the pain away." "Wouldn't that feel good, Amy?" I shook my head, biting my lip to keep from crying out. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my mind warring between fear and the tiny spark of hope this thing was trying to kindle. What if it really could bring him back? What if I could finally be free of the guilt? But then I remembered the shadow's laughter, the way it had twisted my own voice against me, and the way it had hunted me relentlessly. This thing didn't want to help me. It wanted to destroy me. "No," I said louder this time, forcing my voice to steady. "You're not him, and you never will be." The figure froze for a moment, as if surprised by my defiance. Then the smile faded, and its face began to shift, melting like wax under a flame. The features I thought I knew twisted and distorted, becoming something monstrous: hollow eyes, sharp teeth, and a shape that stretched and rippled like liquid darkness. The whispers around me turned into guttural screams, a cacophony that made my ears ache. The shadow surged forward, no longer pretending to be my brother. It towered over me, its form blotting out the weak moonlight. I stumbled backward, panic surging through me, and tripped over a rock. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight tumbling from my grasp and landing a few feet away. The shadow loomed closer, its outstretched arms pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. It laughed again, deep and resonant, as if it had already won. "You can't run from me, Amy," it said, its voice echoing inside my head. "You brought me here. You invited me." I scrambled toward the flashlight, the only weapon I had left. I wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not ever. I lunged for the flashlight, my fingers brushing against the cold metal just as the shadow surged closer. Its form twisted unnaturally, tendrils of darkness snaking toward me like claws ready to drag me into the abyss. My heart pounded as I gripped the flashlight tightly and turned it toward the creature. The beam flickering weakly but still cutting through the oppressive darkness. The light struck its form, and for a brief moment, the shadow recoiled, writhing as if the faint beam burned its essence. Its guttural scream pierced the night, and I used the moment to scramble to my feet, my knees wobbling beneath me. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the flashlight wildly, trying to keep the creature at bay. But it didn't stop. The shadow coiled and reformed, looming larger and darker than before. The light wasn't enough. It was too weak. I needed something stronger, something to sever its hold on me for good. My mind raced, searching for a way out as the whispers and screams closed in around me, pushing me toward the edge of panic. Then I remembered the stones, the altar. My breath caught as a desperate plan formed in my mind. The stones I'd seen earlier on the trail, the ones stacked like an altar, had felt wrong from the start, like they didn't belong there. What if they were connected to this thing? What if they were the source of its power? Without another thought, I turned and bolted down the trail, the flashlight bouncing in my hand as I ran. The shadow roared behind me, its voice like thunder, shaking the air around me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and I stumbled but kept moving, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it closing in, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing against my back. The altar came into view, a crude stack of weathered stones arranged in a circular pattern. I skidded to a stop, panting, my chest heaving as I shone the flashlight over it. The stones were covered in strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize but that seemed to writhe and shift under the beam of light. My stomach churned as I reached out, hesitating for a split second before grabbing the top stone. The shadow screamed again, its voice filled with rage. The ground shook violently, and I nearly lost my footing as the air around the altar grew colder, biting into my skin. "No!" the shadow bellowed, its voice deeper and more terrifying than ever. "You don't know what you're doing!" But I didn't stop. I hurled the top stone to the ground, watching as it shattered into pieces. The carving seemed to glow briefly before fading into nothingness. The shadow convulsed, its form flickering like a dying flame. I grabbed another stone, smashing it against the altar with all my strength. The darkness around me began to thin, the oppressive whispers fading into distant echoes. The shadow screamed one last time, its form collapsing in on itself, and then it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I stood there frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence that followed the shadow's disappearance wasn't comforting. It was heavy, like the calm before a storm. My flashlight flickered weakly, barely holding on to life, and I shivered as the cold air seemed to seep into my bones. The altar was in ruins, the stones shattered and scattered across the ground. The carvings, once alive with malevolent energy, now lay inert. But I wasn't convinced it was over. The desert around me felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. I turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam slicing through the blackness, searching for any sign that the shadow might still be lurking. My heartbeat refused to slow, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost too soft to hear. "Amy!" My blood ran cold, but this time, it wasn't the same. The whisper wasn't layered with malice, wasn't mocking or cruel. It was soft, gentle, almost familiar. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I strained to listen, my pulse quickening despite the calmness in the voice. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whisper didn't come again, but something else caught my eye. In the rubble of the altar, something glinted faintly under the weak beam of my flashlight. Cautiously, I crouched down and brushed the dust away. My hand trembled as I pulled out a small object, a tarnished, silver locket. Its surface was etched with faint symbols, similar to the ones on the stones but more intricate, almost delicate. It felt warm to the touch, pulsing faintly in my palm, as if it had its own heartbeat. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to drop it, to leave it where I'd found it. But something about it compelled me, a strange mix of dread and longing. With shaking hands, I pried it open. Inside was a faded photograph, small and grainy, but unmistakable. It was Danny. His face stared back at me, smiling the way he always had before the accident. Tears welled in my eyes as I clutched the locket to my chest. The realization hit me like a punch. This was what the shadow had been guarding, what it had been trying to use against me. My grief, my guilt, had twisted those emotions to trap me. But now, holding the locket, I felt something else. Not freedom, not yet, but a faint glimmer of closure. The wind picked up, breaking the stillness around me. It carried the faint sound of a voice, Danny's voice, calling my name one last time, soft and fleeting, like a memory slipping away. I looked into the darkness, half expecting to see him, but there was nothing. Just the empty desert stretching endlessly before me. I stood slowly, the locket still clutched in my hand, and turned back toward the trail. The RV was still out there, my only shelter in this vast, unforgiving place. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. The shadow was gone, for now. But I knew it wasn't the only thing waiting in the darkness. The walk back to the RV felt like a lifetime. Each step was heavy, the silence of the desert pressing against my ears like a weight. My flashlight barely held on, its flickering beam casting long, jittery shadows on the rocks around me. Every rustle of the wind through the brush made me flinch, and the memory of the shadow's form loomed large in my mind. When I finally reached the RV, I stopped dead in my tracks. The outside was worse than I remembered. Deep claw marks gouged the metal, some trailing all the way down to the ground. The windows were streaked with something dark and sticky, almost like tar, but it smelled metallic, like blood. My stomach churned as I approached the door, gripping the handle with a shaky hand. It was unlocked. I hadn't left it that way. I pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges creaking like a scream in the quiet night. Inside, the chaos from earlier was still there. Dishes shattered on the floor, drawers flung open, and my camera bag tipped over, its contents spilling onto the small kitchenette counter. But something was different. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of something dripping echoed in the cramped space. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. My flashlight flickered over the floor, and that's when I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them. They were smeared across the walls, the cabinets, and even the ceiling. Each print was dark and wet, leaving behind an oily residue that made my skin crawl. They were too large to be human, the fingers elongated and claw-like, but what sent a shiver through me was the size of the smallest prints. Childlike, impossibly small, yet just as twisted. My chest tightened as I moved through the RV, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to know if it was still here. My flashlight beam swept across the small bed in the back, and I froze. There, lying neatly on the pillow, was the locket. I'd had it in my hand when I left the altar. I was sure of it. My heart pounded as I approached it, the air around me growing colder with every step. The locket gleamed faintly, its surface unmarred, despite the chaos around it. When I picked it up, the warmth I'd felt earlier was gone. It was ice cold now, sending a chill through my fingers. As I stood there, staring at the locket, the faint sound of whispers began to rise. They were soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent. My name echoed through the RV, layered and distorted, coming from every direction. Amy, you can't leave. I whipped around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, stretching and twisting into shapes that weren't entirely human. And then I realized the horrifying truth. The RV wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a trap. The whispers swirled around me, growing louder, filling every corner of the RV. They weren't just voices anymore. They were layered with something deeper, darker, a sound that felt like it came from inside my own head. My name echoed over and over, distorted and pleading, like the desert itself was calling me. I stumbled back toward the door, gripping the locket tightly in one hand and the flashlight in the other. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The air in the RV had grown thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The claw marks, the handprints, the whispers, it all felt alive, as if the RV itself was under the shadow's control. Then the lights began to flicker. The faint glow from the interior light bulbs stuttered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the walls. At first I thought it was just the electricity failing again, but then I noticed something horrifying. The shadows on the walls weren't mine. They moved independently, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't match my movements. One by one, they began to take shape. Long, jagged forms with claw-like hands and hollow, gaping mouths. My breath hitched as one of the shadows broke away from the wall and slithered across the floor toward me. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating more shadows as they peeled themselves from the walls and ceiling, crawling toward me with an almost predatory hunger. I screamed, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. The locket burned cold against my palm, the metal searing into my skin as I clutched it tighter. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, but the shadows only laughed, their distorted voices blending into the chaos. "You can't escape us," one of them hissed, its form stretching upward until it loomed over me. Its hollow eyes seemed to pull me in, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't look away. "You belong here now." I snapped out of my trance and lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt clumsy, numb from the cold radiating off the locket. Behind me, the whispers turned into shrieks, and I could feel the shadows closing in, their presence like icy tendrils, brushing against my skin. The lock clicked open, and I threw the door wide, stumbling out into the cold desert night. The wind hit me like a slap, sharp and biting, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating air inside the RV. I turned back, expecting the shadows to follow, but they stopped just inside the door, their jagged forms writhing against an invisible barrier. They didn't leave. They couldn't. The RV was their prison now, or maybe mine. The whispers faded as the door slammed shut behind me, and the night was silent once more. But I knew better than to believe it was over. I wasn't safe yet. Not even close. I stood outside the RV, trembling, the cold desert air biting into my skin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of my ragged breathing. My flashlight had gone dim, its battery on its last legs, leaving me with nothing but the faint glow of the moon to illuminate the barren landscape around me. The RV loomed behind me, dark and foreboding, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. The shadows were still in there. I could feel them, their malevolent presence pressed against the thin walls, waiting, watching. The thought of stepping back inside made my stomach churn, but the vast desert around me wasn't any safer. I was completely alone with nowhere to go and no one to call for help. Clutching the locket, I looked down at it again. The metal was ice cold, the faint etchings on its surface glowing softly in the moonlight. I didn't know what it was or why it had appeared, but I knew it was tied to everything that had happened. It was both a key and a curse, and it had drawn the shadow to me like a beacon. I wanted to throw it away, to hurl it into the darkness and never see it again. But as I held it in my palm, I felt something, faint but unmistakable. A warmth deep and fleeting, like a heartbeat. My brother's face flashed in my mind, his smile so vivid it made my chest ache. "Danny," I whispered, my voice cracking. The locket didn't respond, of course, but the warmth lingered. It was a reminder of what I had lost, but also of what the shadow had tried to take from me. My will, my grief, and my love for him. Whatever this thing was, it had fed on my pain, using it to manipulate me. And I'd almost let it win. I turned my gaze to the desert, scanning the endless expanse of rocks and scrub. My truck was parked several miles away, near the park entrance, but the trail leading back was treacherous in the dark. The idea of walking it alone with no light and the shadow still lurking nearby made my legs feel weak. But I didn't have a choice. The first step was the hardest. The desert seemed to hold its breath as I started walking, the crunch of my boots against the gravel sounding deafeningly loud in the stillness. Every shadow cast by the moonlight felt like it was watching me. Every gust of wind carried the faint echo of whispers. "Amy!" I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept my eyes forward, gripping the locket tightly in one hand and the dying flashlight in the other. The trail was faint, barely visible under the pale glow of the moon, but I knew if I kept moving, I would eventually reach safety. The whispers grew fainter with every step, but they never disappeared entirely. Even as the RV faded into the distance, I knew the shadow wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. And as I walked deeper into the darkness, I realized something chilling. It wasn't just tied to the RV, it was tied to me. So that's how my peaceful trip turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. To this day, I can still hear whispers in quiet moments, and I'll never step foot in Big Bend National Park again. What do you think? Was it supernatural, or was I losing my mind? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and share it with your fellow thrill seekers. And if you want more hair-raising adventures, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Stay safe, and remember, never camp alone. See you in the next video.